German prisoners expected torture and death from Americans. Nazi propaganda promised brutal treatment in enemy camps. Instead, they found hot meals and medical care. The shock of human dignity would transform them forever. The cattle cars grinding to a halt at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, carried more than just German prisoners of war. They carried men who had spent the journey preparing themselves for torture, execution, or slow death through starvation and brutality. Wehrmacht Obergefreiter Hans Müller pressed his face against the wooden slats, expecting to see gallows or firing squads. Instead, he saw American soldiers standing casually with clipboards and coffee cups. The doors slid open with a metallic screech that made the prisoners flinch. They had been conditioned to expect violence at every transition. Nazi propaganda had filled their heads with stories of American savagery, tales of prisoners tortured for information, worked to death in labor camps, denied medical care as policy. What happened next would shatter everything they thought they knew about their enemies. "Guten Morgen, gentlemen," called out an American sergeant in accented but clear German. "Please form a line for medical inspection and processing. Anyone requiring immediate medical attention, step forward now." The silence stretched like a held breath. German prisoners exchanged bewildered glances, certain this was elaborate psychological torture designed to lull them into false security. Surely the Americans wouldn't address enemy soldiers as gentlemen. Surely they weren't offering medical care before interrogation. Hauptmann Otto Fischer, a veteran panzer officer who had expected to die rather than surrender, found himself stepping forward despite his better judgment. A piece of shrapnel near his spine had been causing him agony for weeks. In the German army, wounded soldiers either fought through the pain or were abandoned. "You are wounded?" asked an American medic, his tone professional but not unkind. Fischer nodded, still expecting some form of trick. Instead, the medic gestured toward a tent marked with a Red Cross symbol. "Please, we will examine you immediately." The processing continued with surreal normalcy that left German prisoners increasingly confused. Instead of being stripped naked and hosed down, they were asked to remove only outer garments for inspection. Instead of having personal possessions confiscated, their belongings were catalogued and stored with care. Wedding rings stayed on fingers. Photographs were returned after inspection. The food came next, and with it, a revelation that would haunt many prisoners for the rest of their lives. Hot coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz substitutes they had been drinking for years. Fresh bread that wasn't mouldy, soup with actual meat, portions that filled rather than merely sustained. Gefreiter Wilhelm Braun stared at the metal tray in his hands and began to weep. For 3 years, he had been told that Americans were soft, decadent, and weak. Yet here they were, feeding their enemies better than the German army had fed its own soldiers. "Why?" he asked in broken English to the American guard standing nearby. "Why do you feed us so well?" The guard, a farm boy from Iowa named Private Peterson, looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Because you're hungry," he replied with matter-of-fact simplicity. "And because it's the right thing to do. The right thing to do." The phrase echoed through the processing center as word spread among the German prisoners. Not because of military advantage or psychological manipulation, but because it was right. The concept was foreign to men, conditioned to see strength through brutality. Medical examinations revealed the extent of American commitment to prisoner welfare. Doctors, actual doctors, not medical orderlies, examined each prisoner with the same thoroughness they would show their own wounded. Wounds were cleaned and dressed. Illnesses were diagnosed and treated. Dr. James Morrison, the camp's chief medical officer, later wrote, "Many of these men arrived in worse condition than our own combat casualties. Malnutrition, untreated injuries, disease, all consequences of their own army's inability to provide proper care. Our first priority is returning them to health." As night fell over Camp Shelby, German prisoners found themselves in heated barracks with real beds, clean blankets, and breakfast promised. Many lay awake, not from fear, but from confusion. Everything they had been taught about American character was proving false. The degenerates and weaklings they had been told to despise were treating them with dignity that their own army had rarely shown. The shock of arrival had become the shock of recognition. Recognition that they had been fighting for a cause that viewed human life as expendable while being captured by enemies who viewed human dignity as sacred. It was the first crack in an ideological foundation that would continue crumbling throughout their captivity. The laughter of American guards drifted through the barracks as German prisoners struggled to understand their new reality. Tomorrow would bring more revelations, more challenges to everything they thought they knew. But tonight, for the first time in months, they would sleep without hunger, cold, and fear. The transformation had begun. The contrast between German and American approaches to prisoner treatment revealed fundamental differences that went far deeper than military doctrine. These weren't merely different methods of handling captives. They represented entirely opposing philosophies about human nature, dignity, and the purpose of warfare itself. German prisoner of war camps operated on principles that reflected Nazi ideology at its core. Prisoners were categorized by race and nationality, with Slavic prisoners receiving the harshest treatment, Jewish prisoners facing immediate execution, and Western Allied prisoners surviving only slightly better conditions. The underlying assumption was that enemies had forfeited their right to basic human dignity. Soviet prisoners of war faced systematic starvation, forced labor, and deliberate extermination. Of the approximately 3.3 million Soviet soldiers captured by German forces, an estimated 2 million died in captivity. This wasn't accidental neglect. It was deliberate policy designed to eliminate what Nazi ideology classified as racially inferior subhumans. American prisoner of war camps operated from fundamentally different premises, rooted in democratic values and international law. The Geneva Convention wasn't viewed as a burden, but as a framework that reflected American principles about human dignity during wartime. Camp commanders received explicit instructions that all prisoners were to be treated as human beings, entitled to basic rights, regardless of their nationality. This wasn't mere propaganda. It was policy enforced through regular inspections and accountability measures. The philosophical difference was immediately apparent in daily operations. German camps were designed around punishment and control, with prisoners viewed as resources to be exploited. American camps were designed around rehabilitation and humane detention, with prisoners viewed as individuals temporarily separated from their families. Food provided the starkest contrast between the two systems. German prisoners in American camps received approximately 2,800 calories per day, more than many German civilians were receiving at home. Soviet prisoners in German camps received fewer than 800 calories per day. Medical care revealed even deeper philosophical divisions. American camp hospitals treated German prisoners with the same standards applied to American soldiers. Surgery was performed when necessary. Medications were provided freely. German medical personnel among the prisoners were amazed that American doctors took the same professional oath to heal regardless of nationality. German camps viewed medical care as a privilege to be earned rather than a right to be respected. Sick prisoners were often left untreated, seen as burdens rather than human beings deserving care. Medical experiments on prisoners were common. Work assignments demonstrated another crucial difference in underlying philosophy. American camps offered voluntary work programs that paid prisoners in camp currency and respected Geneva Convention limitations. Prisoners could choose to participate or decline without punishment. German camps used forced labor as both economic exploitation and psychological torture. Prisoners were worked to exhaustion without regard for safety or health. The goal wasn't merely production, but the systematic degradation of human beings. Educational opportunities available to German prisoners in American camps shocked men who had never experienced intellectual freedom. Libraries contained books on philosophy, literature, history, and science. University courses were offered through correspondence programs. Discussion groups were encouraged rather than forbidden. German camps forbade education entirely, viewing knowledge as dangerous to prisoner control. Reading materials were limited to Nazi propaganda, and intellectual discussions were punished severely. Religious practice provided another window into competing value systems. American camps provided chaplains for different faiths, respected dietary restrictions, and allowed prisoners to observe religious holidays. German camps actively suppressed religious practice, seeing faith as a threat to ideological control. Recreation seemed trivial, but revealed profound differences in human treatment. American camps organized sports leagues, provided musical instruments, and encouraged cultural activities that maintained prisoner morale. German camps viewed recreation as weakness that undermined proper discipline. Male and family contact demonstrated the starkest philosophical divide. American camps facilitated regular correspondence with families and helped arrange Red Cross visits when possible. German camps used mail as a weapon of psychological torture, withholding letters or never delivering them. The cumulative effect created entirely different universes of human experience. German prisoners in American camps lived with dignity intact and humanity respected. Allied prisoners in German camps faced systematic dehumanization designed to break spirits along with bodies. These differences reflected fundamental choices about human nature that revealed the true character of the competing systems. One viewed enemies as fellow human beings temporarily on the wrong side. The other viewed enemies as subhuman obstacles to be eliminated. German prisoners experiencing American treatment struggled to process the cognitive dissonance. Everything they had been taught about strength and proper order was being challenged by captors who maintained discipline while showing mercy. The transformation would begin with this recognition that strength and decency weren't opposites, but could coexist in a system that valued human dignity as the foundation of all other values. The morning reveille at Camp Alva, Oklahoma, shattered German expectations as thoroughly as Allied bombs had shattered their cities. Instead of harsh shouts and physical abuse, American guards woke prisoners with firm but respectful commands. Guten Morgen, time for breakfast, called Sergeant Williams, a former German teacher from Minnesota. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter rolled off his bunk, expecting the worst. In German military tradition, mornings began with screaming sergeants, punitive exercises, and immediate punishment for infractions. Instead, he found American guards chatting casually while prisoners organized themselves into orderly lines. The breakfast itself defied every assumption about American weakness that Nazi propaganda had drilled into German minds. Real eggs, not powdered substitutes, German soldiers had been eating for 2 years. Fresh milk that hadn't been watered down, coffee that actually contained coffee beans rather than ersatz substitutes, bread that was soft, white, and plentiful. Private Heinrich Weber stared at his plate in disbelief. "They feed us better than our own officers ate," he whispered to his bunkmate. By 1943, even Wehrmacht officers were subsisting on severely reduced rations, while American prisoners were receiving more calories than German civilians. Work details began after breakfast, but American practices confounded German expectations. Instead of being marched at gunpoint to brutal labor assignments, prisoners were asked to volunteer for various jobs around the camp. Those who chose to work received payment in camp currency. The concept of voluntary prisoner labor was so foreign to German military thinking that many POWs initially suspected a trap. Surely this was psychological manipulation designed to identify troublemakers. The idea that captors would actually pay prisoners for work seemed impossible. Hans Kruger, a veteran of the Russian front, volunteered for kitchen duty partly out of curiosity. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about American character. The camp kitchen operated under strict sanitation standards that exceeded those in most German civilian restaurants. More shocking was the discovery that American guards ate the same food as the prisoners. Medical care provided another daily reminder of the philosophical gulf between German and American approaches to human dignity. Camp infirmary visits revealed American medics who treated German wounds with the same professional care they would provide to their own troops. Dental problems that had been ignored for months received immediate attention. Dr. Robert Hansen, the camp's chief medical officer, later wrote, "These men arrived in worse physical condition than many of our own combat casualties." Years of inadequate nutrition and medical neglect had taken a severe toll. Our job was healing, not punishment. Recreation time proved equally revelatory. American camps provided sports equipment, musical instruments, and recreational activities that German prisoners had never experienced during their own military service. Soccer matches were organized between different barracks. Musical instruments allowed prisoners to form bands. The library became a particular source of wonder for German POWs who had been restricted to Nazi-approved reading materials for over a decade. Books on philosophy, literature, history, and science were freely available. American librarians helped prisoners locate reading materials in German. Unteroffizier Friedrich Lang, a former teacher drafted into military service, spent hours reading books that had been banned in Germany since 1933. "I had forgotten," he wrote in his diary, "that ideas could exist without political approval." Educational opportunities extended beyond reading to formal classes and discussion groups. American instructors offered courses in English language, American history, and democratic principles. Participation was voluntary, but enrollment was surprisingly high among prisoners hungry for intellectual stimulation. Religious services provided another dimension of daily life that challenged German preconceptions. American chaplains of various denominations offered services for different faith traditions, respecting the religious diversity among the prisoner population. Mail call became a daily highlight that reinforced connections to humanity that German military culture had systematically discouraged. Letters from home were delivered uncensored, allowing prisoners to maintain genuine relationships with families. The psychological impact of preserved human connections proved profound. Evening hours brought the most surprising revelation: the sound of laughter. American guards and German prisoners gradually developed relationships that transcended the traditional captor-prisoner dynamic. Guards who spoke German shared stories of their own families, treating prisoners as individuals. The cumulative effect of daily life that respected human dignity while maintaining necessary security created cognitive dissonance that many German prisoners struggled to process. Everything they had been taught about American weakness and moral degeneracy was being disproven through lived experience. As lights out approached each evening, prisoners found themselves in heated barracks with full stomachs, clean clothes, and medical care. For many, it was better treatment than they had received in their own army. The routine of respect was reshaping German understanding of strength, discipline, and proper order. Perhaps most unsettling was the realization that their captor's humanity didn't represent weakness, it represented a different kind of strength entirely. The Geneva Convention of 1929 had established international standards for prisoner of war treatment, but most German soldiers had never seen these principles implemented with systematic precision until they experienced American captivity firsthand. What they discovered was not mere compliance with international law, but a comprehensive framework that treated adherence to these standards as a matter of national honor. Colonel James Patterson, commandant of Camp Forest, Tennessee, had received explicit instructions from the War Department that made American policy crystal clear. Compliance with the Geneva Convention is not optional, his briefing materials stated. It represents our commitment to civilized conduct, even under the extreme pressures of total war. German prisoners arriving at American camps encountered this commitment immediately through systematic documentation. Every prisoner was photographed, fingerprinted, and assigned a detailed file that tracked their medical condition, work assignments, correspondence, and behavioral observations. This wasn't surveillance for punishment, it was accountability for protection. The contrast with German prisoner of war practices was stark. Soviet prisoners in German camps were often not registered at all, existing in administrative limbo that facilitated their systematic extermination. American documentation served as legal protection for prisoners and accountability for guards. Medical care provided the most visible demonstration of Geneva Convention implementation in practice. Article 15 required that prisoners receive medical attention equivalent to that provided to the detaining power's own forces. American camps interpreted this literally, establishing infirmaries staffed by qualified physicians who treated German patients with identical protocols used for American soldiers. German medical officers, among the prisoner population, documented this care with professional amazement. Hauptmann Heinrich Müller, a former Wehrmacht surgeon, wrote detailed notes describing surgical procedures performed on German prisoners that exceeded the quality of care available in many German civilian hospitals before the war. They operated on Obergefreiter Richter's shattered leg with the same precision and care they would show for their own wounded, Müller recorded. The surgeon spent 3 hours reconstructing bones that our own field medics would have simply amputated. Food provisions under Article 11 required that prisoner rations be equivalent in quantity and quality to those provided to depot troops. American camps exceeded this standard systematically, providing prisoners with approximately 2,800 calories daily when many American civilians were receiving fewer calories due to wartime rationing. Work assignments followed Article 27 provisions that prohibited dangerous, unhealthy, or degrading labor while requiring payment for voluntary work. American camps established detailed protocols, with work hours limited to 8 per day with mandatory rest periods. The voluntary nature of work assignments confounded German prisoners who had never experienced military service where individual choice played any role in duty assignments. Refusing work detail in the German army meant court-martial and severe punishment. Refusing work in American camps meant reduced privileges but no punishment. Educational opportunities went beyond Geneva Convention requirements, reflecting American democratic values. Camp libraries contained thousands of books in German, including philosophy and literature texts that had been banned in Germany since 1933. University correspondence courses were available to prisoners who demonstrated academic interest. Religious practice received protection under Article 16, which guaranteed freedom of worship according to prisoners' faith traditions. American camps provided chaplains for different denominations while respecting the rights of non-religious prisoners. Religious services were conducted in German by German chaplains among the prisoner population. This religious freedom represented a profound departure from German military practice, where chaplains were increasingly required to incorporate Nazi racial ideology into their sermons. Many German prisoners attended voluntary religious services for the first time in years. Male privileges under Article 36 were implemented with scrupulous attention to prisoner rights and family connections. Letters were censored only for military intelligence, not personal content. Prisoners could write multiple letters weekly, receive packages from home, and maintain relationships that German military culture had systematically discouraged. Red Cross inspections were welcomed rather than feared, with camp administrators treating inspection reports as professional evaluations rather than hostile investigations. Swiss representatives conducting neutral inspections consistently rated American prisoner of war camps among the highest in the world for Geneva Convention compliance. Legal protections under Article 60 provided prisoners with rights that German courts-martial had never recognized. Disciplinary proceedings followed due process requirements with representation and appeals processes. Punishments were proportional to infractions and focused on correction rather than retribution. Recreation facilities and activities went far beyond convention minimums, reflecting American understanding that maintaining prisoner morale served humanitarian purposes. Sports equipment, musical instruments, and cultural activities were provided generously. The cumulative effect of comprehensive Geneva Convention implementation created an environment where German prisoners experienced international law as lived reality rather than theoretical concept. They discovered that civilized standards of conduct were not signs of weakness but expressions of strength. This discovery would prove transformative for men who had been taught that strength required brutality. American implementation demonstrated that democratic societies could be simultaneously humane and militarily effective, a combination Nazi ideology claimed was impossible. The ideological awakening of German prisoners in American camps happened through a gradual process that challenged everything they had been taught about their enemies and themselves. For men immersed in Nazi propaganda since childhood, encountering American reality created psychological conflicts that would reshape their understanding of the world. Obergefreiter Werner Hoffmann had been 15 when Hitler came to power, meaning his entire worldview had been shaped by Nazi education. Everything he knew about Americans came from caricatures. They were weak, racially mixed degenerates who lacked the will to fight. The reality of American camps shattered these preconceptions so completely that many prisoners initially assumed they were experiencing psychological warfare. The first crack in ideological certainty came through human interactions that contradicted propaganda stereotypes. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien, a guard at Camp McCain in Mississippi, spoke fluent German and engaged prisoners in conversation about their families and experiences. What shocked German prisoners wasn't his language skills, but his genuine interest in them as individuals. He asked about my wife, my children, my job before the war, Hoffmann later wrote, not for intelligence purposes, but because he cared about people. This American soldier, who our propaganda told us was our racial inferior, showed more humanity than many of our own officers. Educational programs provided systematic challenges to Nazi historical narratives. Camp libraries contained books banned in Germany for over a decade, including works by Jewish authors, democratic philosophers, and historians who presented alternative perspectives on German history. The discovery that Heinrich Heine, one of Germany's greatest poets, had been Jewish shocked prisoners who had believed Jewish contributions to German culture were minimal. Reading uncensored histories of the First World War revealed propaganda distortions about German defeat that had been fundamental to Nazi mythology. Dr. Friedrich Weber, a captured Wehrmacht physician and former university professor, spent months rediscovering suppressed knowledge. I realized how much we had forgotten, how much had been hidden from us. He wrote, ideas I had once considered normal were now classified as treasonous. Discussion groups organized by American educational officers provided forums where prisoners could explore new ideas safely. Initially, many were reluctant to participate, fearing that expressing doubts might be reported to German authorities after the war. American assurances of confidentiality gradually broke down these barriers. The discussions often became heated as prisoners, with different backgrounds confronted conflicting interpretations of recent history. Younger soldiers who had known only Nazi education clashed with older prisoners who remembered pre-Nazi Germany. Veterans of different fronts brought different experiences of the war's brutality. These conflicts reflected the broader psychological crisis that American treatment was creating. Everything they had been taught about strength and weakness was being contradicted by daily experience. Americans who were supposed to be weak were demonstrating strength through restraint. Interactions with German-American guards provided particularly powerful challenges to Nazi racial ideology. These staff members had German names, spoke German fluently, understood German culture intimately, yet embodied American values. They were living proof that German heritage could thrive within American society without requiring authoritarian control. Sergeant Hans Müller, whose grandparents had emigrated from Bavaria, became a mentor figure for many struggling prisoners. His ability to discuss German literature while defending American democratic principles created bridges that helped prisoners navigate their psychological transitions. He knew more about Goethe than most of our teachers, one prisoner noted. But he also understood freedom in ways we had never been taught. He showed us that loving German culture didn't require hating other peoples. Religious discussions played a crucial role in the awakening process. Many prisoners had grown up Christian, but had been taught that Nazi ideology superseded religious teachings. American chaplains helped prisoners rediscover traditions that emphasized human dignity and universal brotherhood rather than racial superiority. The ideological transformation was often painful and disorienting. Prisoners questioning Nazi teachings found themselves adrift without familiar anchors. Everything they had believed about history, politics, and national identity was open to question. American administrators understood this psychological transformation was delicate. Counseling services and group discussions provided support systems that helped prisoners navigate these challenges safely. The transformation process was neither uniform nor complete. Some prisoners remained committed to Nazi ideology despite exposure to alternatives, but a significant number underwent profound conversions that would influence their post-war lives. Letters home began reflecting these changes as prisoners shared experiences with families in Germany. Censors noted increasing references to American kindness, democratic principles, and questions about Nazi propaganda. The psychological journey from Nazi believer to democratic convert was neither quick nor easy, but American camps provided the intellectual freedom necessary for genuine transformation. For many prisoners, captivity became liberation from a system that had imprisoned their minds. The process revealed that even systematic indoctrination could be overcome through patient exposure to truth and intellectual freedom. The men who emerged would carry these lessons back to Germany. The work programs established in American prisoner of war camps represented a revolutionary approach to captive labor that challenged German assumptions about enemy character and proper treatment of prisoners. Unlike forced labor systems that German forces had implemented throughout occupied Europe, American work assignments operated on principles of voluntary participation, fair compensation, and Geneva Convention compliance. The morning work call at Camp Hearn, Texas, began not with shouted orders and physical coercion, but with requests for volunteers posted on bulletin boards. Prisoners could choose from various assignments: agricultural work on nearby farms, construction projects within the camp, kitchen duties, maintenance tasks, or clerical work. Those who preferred not to work faced no punishment beyond reduced privileges, a concept so foreign to German military experience that many prisoners initially assumed it was a trap. Obergefreiter Karl Richter, a former factory worker from the Ruhr Valley, volunteered for agricultural duty partly out of curiosity. What he discovered challenged everything he had been taught about American work ethic and prisoner treatment. The local farmer, Henry Johnson, treated German prisoners with the same respect he showed his regular hired hands. They received the same safety equipment, rest breaks, and cold water during hot Texas afternoons. He never called us names or treated us like animals, Richter later wrote. When I cut my hand on farm equipment, he drove me to town for medical treatment himself. This American farmer showed more concern for enemy prisoners than our own officers had shown for their own soldiers. The payment system for prisoner labor shocked men who had grown up under economic systems where worker compensation was determined by political considerations rather than economic principles. Prisoners received camp currency at rates equivalent to American minimum wage standards, money that could be used to purchase personal items, recreational materials, and savings for post-war repatriation. The concept of voluntary labor compensation was so alien to German military thinking that many prisoners initially refused to believe the payments were real. In German labor systems, work was an obligation enforced through punishment rather than a service rewarded through compensation. The idea that captors would voluntarily pay prisoners for work seemed to violate natural hierarchies that Nazi ideology claimed were universal. Educational opportunities provided alongside work programs revealed American commitment to prisoner rehabilitation rather than mere exploitation. Camp administrators established partnerships with nearby universities to offer correspondence courses in various subjects, from basic literacy to advanced engineering. German prisoners could pursue academic interests that had been suppressed under Nazi educational restrictions. Technical training programs proved particularly popular among German prisoners who recognized that post-war reconstruction would require new skills. Courses in democratic governance, free market economics, and constitutional law provided frameworks for understanding American success that Nazi propaganda had never adequately explained. Interaction with American civilian workers created cultural exchanges that broke down stereotypes on both sides. German prisoners working on construction projects discovered that American workers were neither the weak degenerates described in Nazi propaganda nor the cultural barbarians portrayed in German media. Instead, they encountered skilled craftsmen who took pride in their work and treated colleagues with respect. American workers discovered that German prisoners were individuals with families, dreams, and fears, rather than the fanatical monsters portrayed in wartime propaganda. These personal relationships often developed into friendships that lasted long after the war ended, creating human connections that transcended political boundaries. Agricultural work programs provided powerful demonstrations of American agricultural productivity and technological advancement. German prisoners working on mechanized farms witnessed techniques and equipment that exceeded anything they had seen in Germany. American farming methods produced yields that seemed impossible according to German agricultural science. The psychological impact of meaningful work cannot be overstated for men who had been trained to find identity through military service. Productive labor that contributed to community welfare restored sense of worth and dignity that captivity might otherwise have destroyed. German prisoners took pride in construction projects and agricultural achievements that demonstrated their continued value as human beings. Language instruction provided crucial bridges between German and American cultures, enabling deeper communication and understanding between former enemies. German prisoners studying English discovered not just linguistic skills, but cultural concepts that had no equivalents in Nazi ideology. Ideas about individual rights, democratic participation, and social mobility were embedded in American language patterns. Vocational training programs prepared German prisoners for post-war careers in democratic societies, providing skills that would prove crucial during German reconstruction efforts. Courses in business management and democratic governance equipped prisoners with knowledge necessary for building institutions that could prevent future authoritarian takeover. Safety regulations enforced during work assignments revealed American commitment to worker protection that exceeded standards in German industry before the war. Prisoners received safety equipment, training, and protection that demonstrated genuine concern for human welfare rather than mere compliance with regulations. Through meaningful work and educational opportunities, German prisoners discovered that strength and prosperity could emerge from cooperation and voluntary exchange rather than conquest and domination. These lessons would influence German reconstruction efforts and contribute to the emergence of democratic German society. The medical care provided to German prisoners in American camps represented one of the most profound contradictions to Nazi ideology that captives would encounter. In a system where human worth was measured by racial classification and political utility, the discovery that enemy soldiers would receive the same medical attention as American troops challenged fundamental assumptions about strength, weakness, and civilized conduct. Dr. Heinrich Moeller, a captured Wehrmacht physician, arrived at Camp Butner, North Carolina, expecting to find the crude field medicine that German propaganda had associated with American military incompetence. Instead, he discovered a fully equipped hospital facility that exceeded the standards of many civilian hospitals in pre-war Germany. The medical equipment was modern, supplies were abundant, and staff demonstrated professional competence that contradicted every stereotype. The first shock came during his own medical examination as a new prisoner. American military physicians treated his war wounds with the same careful attention they would provide to their own casualties. A piece of shrapnel that had been embedded in his shoulder for months, ignored by German field medics who lacked time and resources, was surgically removed by American doctors who spent 3 hours ensuring proper healing. They treated me as a patient, not as an enemy, Moeller later wrote. The surgeon, Colonel Richardson, discussed my case with the same professional interest he would show for any medical challenge. There was no hatred, no desire for revenge, only medical professionalism and human compassion. The systematic approach to prisoner healthcare revealed American commitment to Geneva Convention principles that went far beyond minimal compliance. Regular medical examinations ensured that chronic conditions were identified and treated before they became serious. Dental care was provided routinely. Mental health support, barely recognized in German military medicine, was available through counseling services. German prisoners, suffering from combat trauma, received psychological care that German military doctrine had never acknowledged as legitimate medical need. The concept that battlefield stress could cause genuine mental illness, requiring professional treatment, contradicted German military culture that viewed such symptoms as cowardice. American military psychiatrists treated combat neurosis as a medical condition deserving attention. The pharmaceutical supplies available to German prisoners amazed medical personnel who had grown accustomed to severe shortages in German military hospitals. Medications that had been unavailable in Germany for years were dispensed freely to prisoners who needed them. Pain relief, infection control, and chronic disease management were provided without regard for cost. Surgical procedures performed on German prisoners demonstrated American medical capabilities that exceeded German expectations. Complex operations that German field hospitals would never have attempted were performed routinely. Recovery rates and surgical outcomes exceeded German military medical standards even from the pre-war period. Training opportunities provided to German medical personnel revealed American willingness to share advanced medical knowledge with former enemies. German doctors were invited to observe surgical techniques, participate in medical conferences, and learn new treatment methods that would benefit German patients after the war. Prosthetics and rehabilitation services provided to wounded German prisoners demonstrated American commitment to restoring human dignity and capability rather than merely maintaining minimal survival. Artificial limbs were manufactured and fitted for German amputees with the same care provided to American veterans. The psychological impact of receiving high-quality medical care from former enemies cannot be overstated for German prisoners, who had been taught that strength required ruthlessness and that mercy represented weakness. American medical personnel demonstrated that compassion and competence could coexist, that professional excellence and human kindness were mutually reinforcing. Medical ethics practiced in American prison camps contradicted Nazi medical philosophy in fundamental ways. Where German military medicine had increasingly incorporated racial theories into treatment decisions, American military medicine maintained professional standards based on medical need rather than political calculation. Research conducted in American prison camp hospitals followed ethical guidelines that German medical practice had abandoned under Nazi influence. Medical experiments were conducted only with full informed consent and for the direct benefit of the patient. This ethical approach stood in stark contrast to the horrific medical experiments being conducted in German concentration camps. The collaborative relationships that developed between German and American medical personnel created professional bonds that transcended political boundaries. German doctors, working alongside American physicians, discovered shared commitment to healing that proved more fundamental than national loyalties. Nutrition programs designed to restore prisoner health demonstrated American understanding that proper medical care required comprehensive approaches to human well-being. German prisoners suffering from malnutrition received carefully designed dietary rehabilitation that gradually restored physical strength and mental clarity. For German prisoners who had been conditioned to associate medical care with military utility and racial classification, receiving compassionate professional treatment from enemy physicians provided profound challenges to fundamental assumptions about human nature, national character, and the relationship between strength and mercy. The transformation of enemy soldiers into patients receiving professional medical care illustrated American commitment to universal human rights that transcended temporary political conflicts, providing German prisoners with experiences of dignity and compassion that would influence their understanding of democratic society long after their return to Germany. The mail system, established in American prisoner of war camps, represented one of the most emotionally powerful demonstrations of democratic values and human dignity that German prisoners would experience during their Versuchsdienst. Captivity. For men who had been systematically trained to suppress emotional attachments in favor of military duty, the ability to maintain genuine connections with loved ones provided profound challenges to Nazi teachings about strength and proper military conduct. The first mail call at Camp Trinidad, Colorado, created scenes that American guards would remember for the rest of their lives. German prisoners who had maintained stoic military composure through capture, transport, and initial processing broke down in tears upon receiving letters from wives, children, and parents they had feared they would never contact again. Obergefreiter Gustav Weber clutched a letter from his wife Maria with shaking hands, afraid to open it after months of uncertainty about her survival during the bombing of German cities. When he finally read her words describing their children's growth, their struggles with wartime rationing, and her desperate hope for his safe return, the psychological impact was transformative. The uncensored nature of personal correspondence shocked German prisoners who had grown accustomed to military and political oversight of all communication. In the German army, letters home were routinely censored not just for military security, but for ideological conformity. Soldiers were expected to maintain propaganda narratives about German strength, even in private communications with family members. American censorship focused exclusively on military intelligence concerns while respecting the privacy and emotional content of personal relationships. Prisoners could express fears, doubts, homesickness, and love without political consequences. They could describe their treatment in American camps honestly, sharing experiences that contradicted Nazi propaganda about enemy brutality. The frequency of mail delivery exceeded German prisoners' expectations based on their own military experience. While German soldiers often waited weeks for letters from home, American camps ensured that mail was processed and delivered within days of arrival. This efficiency demonstrated American organizational capabilities and commitment to prisoner welfare. Family photographs included in letters provided visual connections to loved ones that sustained morale and maintained human dignity during extended captivity. German prisoners created improvised shrines around photographs of wives and children, displaying them proudly despite military traditions that discouraged personal sentimentality. The ability to send packages home when shipping conditions permitted allowed German prisoners to maintain their roles as providers and family members despite physical separation. Prisoners used earnings from work programs to purchase small gifts that demonstrated continued care for family welfare. Care packages received from Germany revealed the dire conditions that German civilians were experiencing under wartime shortages and Allied bombing campaigns. Letters describing food rationing, housing destruction, and daily survival struggles provided German prisoners with realistic perspectives on home-front conditions that contrasted sharply with Nazi propaganda. The psychological impact of maintained family connections cannot be overstated for men who had been trained to subordinate personal relationships to military duty. Nazi ideology had systematically attempted to replace family loyalty with political devotion, teaching that true strength required emotional independence from civilian concerns. American mail policies demonstrated that acknowledging family bonds strengthened rather than weakened military personnel. Translation services provided for illiterate prisoners ensured that educational background did not prevent family communication. American volunteers, often German-speaking immigrants or soldiers with language training, helped prisoners write letters and understand correspondence. These translation services demonstrated democratic values about equal access regardless of educational attainment. Religious correspondence with family members provided opportunities for German prisoners to reconnect with spiritual traditions that Nazi ideology had attempted to suppress. Letters discussing faith and religious observances helped prisoners rediscover religious identities that had been subordinated to political requirements. Children's letters and drawings provided particularly powerful emotional connections that transcended political boundaries. German prisoners, receiving artwork from their children, often shared these treasures with American guards and fellow prisoners, creating moments of universal human recognition that war could not eliminate. The gradual revelation through family correspondence that Nazi promises about German victory were false created ideological crises that forced prisoners to choose between political loyalty and family welfare. Letters describing deteriorating conditions in Germany contradicted official propaganda about German strength. Letters written by German prisoners often described their American captivity experiences in terms that challenged Nazi propaganda and influenced German civilian attitudes toward American character and democratic institutions. These personal testimonies from trusted family members proved more influential than official propaganda. The mail system in American prisoner of war camps demonstrated that strength and security could coexist with compassion and human dignity, providing German prisoners with practical examples of democratic governance that valued both collective security and individual welfare. The psychological transformation of German prisoners in American camps was neither immediate nor universal, but for those who experienced it, the change was profound and lasting. The process unfolded gradually through accumulated experiences that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature, national character, and the relationship between strength and morality. The transformation typically began with confusion and cognitive dissonance, as prisoners struggled to reconcile their expectations with reality. Hauptmann Friedrich Lang, a veteran officer who had served on both fronts, later described the early stages. Everything I had been taught about Americans was proving false. They were supposed to be weak, yet they had defeated our armies. They were supposed to be brutal, yet they treated us with dignity. The role of American camp personnel in facilitating this transformation cannot be overstated. Rather than attempting to indoctrinate prisoners through force or propaganda, American staff members demonstrated democratic values through their daily actions and interactions. They modeled respect for individual dignity, showed consistency between stated principles and actual behavior, and created environments where prisoners could safely explore new ideas. Captain Robert Morrison, a camp educational officer fluent in German, became a catalyst for change among many prisoners through his patient willingness to engage in honest discussions about political philosophy, history, and human rights. Rather than lecturing about American superiority, he asked questions that encouraged prisoners to examine their own beliefs. The educational programs established in American camps provided structured opportunities for ideological examination and growth. Discussion groups that began with basic topics like American geography gradually evolved into deeper explorations of democratic principles, individual rights, and the rule of law. Prisoners who had been raised to accept authority without question found themselves encouraged to think critically. German prisoners participating in these programs often experienced internal conflicts as they began to recognize contradictions in Nazi ideology that they had never been permitted to examine. Unteroffizier Hans Müller, a former teacher drafted into military service, described his gradual awakening. For the first time in years, I was allowed to think freely. The transformation process was neither uniform nor complete across all prisoners. Some remained committed to Nazi ideology, despite exposure to alternative perspectives. Others experienced only partial awakenings that left them confused and conflicted, but a significant number underwent profound ideological conversions that would influence their post-war lives. The most dramatic transformations occurred among prisoners who had been fanatical supporters of Nazi ideology before their capture. Obergefreiter Werner Schmidt, a former Hitler Youth leader who had volunteered for military service at 17, initially refused to participate in educational programs or engage with American staff beyond basic requirements. His gradual change began when he witnessed American soldiers sharing their own food rations with hungry German prisoners during a supply shortage. I realized that these Americans were acting more like the ideal Germans we were supposed to be than we had ever acted ourselves, Schmidt later wrote. The role of German-American staff members proved particularly influential in the transformation process. These individuals served as living examples that German heritage and democratic values could coexist harmoniously. They demonstrated that loving German culture did not require accepting Nazi political ideology or supporting authoritarian governance. Religious counseling and spiritual exploration played crucial roles for many prisoners undergoing ideological transformation. American chaplains helped prisoners rediscover religious traditions that emphasized human dignity, compassion, and moral responsibility rather than racial superiority and blind obedience to political authority. The practical preparation for post-war life became increasingly important as prisoners began to anticipate their eventual repatriation to Germany. American camp administrators understood that transformed prisoners could become valuable advocates for democratic reconstruction, so they provided additional education in democratic governance and constitutional law. Vocational training programs prepared prisoners not just for economic survival, but for leadership roles in post-war German society. Former Nazi supporters who had experienced genuine ideological transformation often became the most effective advocates for democratic change because they understood both systems from personal experience. The psychological support systems, established in American camps, helped prisoners navigate the emotional difficulties of ideological transformation. Abandoning deeply held beliefs, even false ones, created identity crises that required professional counseling and peer support. The gradual recognition among transformed prisoners that they could contribute to building a better Germany provided purpose and hope that sustained them through the difficult final months of captivity. Rather than viewing themselves as defeated enemies, they began to see themselves as potential bridges between American democratic experience and German reconstruction needs. The transformation process revealed that even systematic indoctrination could be overcome through patient exposure to democratic values lived rather than merely preached. The men who underwent this psychological journey would carry their experiences back to Germany, where they would become advocates for democratic institutions. The legacy of respectful treatment that German prisoners of war experienced in American camps extended far beyond the end of World War II, creating ripple effects that would influence German reconstruction, international relations, and human rights principles for generations. What began as military necessity guided by Geneva Convention requirements evolved into a demonstration of democratic values that would reshape how former enemies understood strength, civilization, and human dignity. The immediate aftermath of prisoner repatriation revealed the profound impact that American treatment had made on German minds and hearts. As former prisoners returned to a devastated Germany in 1945 and 1946, they brought stories that challenged every assumption their fellow Germans had held about American character and democratic society. These personal testimonies proved more powerful than any propaganda campaign in changing German attitudes. Obergefreiter Hans Weber returning to his hometown of Munich after 2 years in Camp Hearn, Texas, found himself serving as an unofficial ambassador for American values among his neighbors and family members. His descriptions of fair treatment, educational opportunities, and genuine respect for human dignity contradicted everything Germans had been told about American brutality. The transformation of individual prisoners created a multiplier effect that influenced entire communities across post-war Germany. Former prisoners became living examples that democratic societies could be both strong and humane, that military victory did not require dehumanizing enemies, and that genuine strength emerged from moral principles rather than brute force. Many former prisoners became active participants in German democratization efforts, using their first-hand knowledge of American democratic institutions to help build similar structures in their homeland. They served as translators, cultural liaisons, and advocates for democratic principles during the occupation period. The educational experiences that prisoners had gained in American camps proved invaluable during German reconstruction efforts. Former prisoners who had studied American history, constitutional law, and democratic governance became teachers, administrators, and political leaders who helped establish democratic institutions in post-war Germany. Dr. Friedrich Weber, the former Wehrmacht physician who had been amazed by American medical care, returned to Germany and became a leading advocate for medical ethics and human rights in healthcare. His experiences receiving compassionate treatment from former enemies influenced his post-war career, rebuilding German medical institutions. The business relationships and economic understanding that prisoners had developed through American work programs contributed to Germany's post-war economic miracle. Former prisoners who had learned about free market principles, labor relations, and democratic business practices became entrepreneurs and managers who helped rebuild German industry according to democratic principles. Letter-writing campaigns organized by former prisoners helped maintain connections between Germany and America that facilitated ongoing diplomatic and cultural relationships. Thousands of German families had learned about American kindness through letters from imprisoned relatives, creating reservoirs of goodwill that supported post-war reconciliation efforts. The children and grandchildren of former prisoners grew up hearing stories about American fairness, democratic values, and respect for human dignity that shaped their understanding of international relations. These family narratives created generational transmission of positive attitudes toward democracy that influenced German political culture for decades. Religious communities in Germany were particularly influenced by former prisoners who had rediscovered their faith through interactions with American chaplains and religious programs. These men returned as advocates for religious freedom, interfaith cooperation, and the role of moral principles in political life. International law and human rights advocacy were significantly influenced by German legal professionals who had experienced American adherence to Geneva Convention principles during their captivity. These lawyers, judges, and legal scholars became advocates for international humanitarian law and human rights protections. The psychological impact on German society was perhaps the most profound and lasting legacy of respectful prisoner treatment. For a nation that had been conditioned to believe that might made right and that enemies deserved brutalization, the example of American humanitarianism provided alternative models for understanding strength, honor, and civilized conduct. Cultural exchanges and ongoing relationships between former prisoners and their American guards, administrators, and communities created lasting bonds that transcended national boundaries. Annual reunions, correspondence, and visits maintained these relationships for decades, providing concrete examples of how former enemies could become friends. Modern German commitment to international human rights, peacekeeping, and diplomatic conflict resolution can be traced in part to the lessons learned by an entire generation that experienced American prisoner treatment during World War II. The transformation of Germany from an aggressive, authoritarian state into a peaceful, democratic partner reflects the long-term impact of treating enemies with dignity. The story of German prisoners in American camps demonstrates that the values societies choose to uphold during times of conflict reveal their true character and determine their ultimate legacy. By treating enemies as human beings deserving of dignity and respect, American society demonstrated strength that proved more transformative than any military victory. The legacy continues today as historians, educators, and policymakers study these experiences to understand how respectful treatment of prisoners can serve both humanitarian and strategic purposes, creating foundations for lasting peace based on shared human dignity.